Hey, welcome back to Guardbeardia. I got for you the next chapter in the Emily Bronze series. Make sure you don't have anything to eat. Apparently this one can cause a bit of sickness. At least I made the Bill damn little sick.
Chapter 3 The Bruising Reality. Emily thought back to that lovely morning, sitting there on the couch, eating scooteros and watching the news in the wholesome comfort of an HVAC system. She rolled the ring around in her hand, her fingers caked in wine-soaked mud, and for the first time in a long time she actually ached for the smell of an espresso machine. The barrel of her Bren rifle scalded her exposed ankle, the boot somewhere in the sucking mud about 600 yards away, and Emily winced angrily, the scratches on her face from where she fell down aching at the stretch of skin. "I had to open my big mouth," Emily sighed, and she looked down at the flooded city of Walla. Weeks before, Ogledock had come to her with a bread run mission down to the Great Salt Lake, probing the shores and looking for anything small that may show up from the doings of the shadow beasts. There had been some alarming reports that larger beings were beginning to poke their heads from the water, and with their arrival that usually meant that they would be tossing larger goodies along the water's edge, or on some of the smaller islands that dotted the giant body of water. Emily had been in a pretty cheeky mood that morning, having gotten settled in and rubbing elbows with her fellow divers. She asked Ogledock for something bigger than a milk run. Ogledock had been unsure about it, but after constant pressuring and light flirting from Emily, Ogledock broke and gave her an assignment to the mountains in the northeast, around the ruins of Kenwick and anything else that touched the Twilight Lake. Emily had been pumped at the prospect of an actual adventure and set out the same day she received her papers, loading up her motorcycle, the trailer, and setting off without delay. The journey northeast was uneventful, stopping at campsites along the way and making friends where she rested. But things took a sharp turn when her motorbike broke into the Blue Mountains. She had felt this vibe before when she would watch videos of the Ukraine war zones, and to be frank, everyone she came across looked as if they had a story to tell about the places they had traveled. Everyone she saw, from old ladies knitting on their porches to the kids playing in the street, were decked out in armor and strapped with a weapon. The fuel station's windows were heavily barred and charmed, glittering with scripts of power and protection so powerful that Emily felt her stomach turn every time she popped into one for a drink or to pay for gasoline. Baker City was her first stop in order to fill her spare fuel container, grab canned goods, and top off her water supply. Besides the usual stores that would be common in a mountain town, there were also huge motel and inn complexes that held specials for recovering divers. When a fellow diver would see Emily, sporting her company patch, they would salute her by holding up their hand in front of their heart, thumb up and two fingers spread out laying horizontally, the same way a German would gesture for three. Emily wasn't sure what the salute meant, but she quickly caught on to the game, reminding her of the special hand gesture bikers give to each other when they pass by on the road. She didn't stay long in Baker City, as it became clear that this was where recoverable bodies were processed and identified. She knew this because she drove by one of the hospitals and saw the recovery wing, where divers would bring body parts they found while out on a hunt. The issue was, there seemed to be a lot of body parts, and there was even a walk-in drop-off center where you could just deposit the found part into a cooled fridge for the recovery of personnel to pick up the next morning. Emily rode past and saw that one soulless-looking fellow was holding a pair of hands, and one looking like a hairy male arm still wearing a wristwatch, the other two mangled to tail. A tendril of dread curled its way around her throat, and she felt the lump forming as she turned her head back to the road. Emily cleared her throat and tried to get her breathing back in order as a thought entered her head. What if it's my hand someone finds? Or a foot? What if they find nothing at all? She shook her head roughly, her helmet jostling, and she clicked the motorcycle into a higher gear. Best not to think about that. When she reached La Grande, she found the town to be mostly devoid of people, except for a few divers camping out on the northerly side of the town near the freshly rooted woods. Nature was taking this town back with resolved aggression, and only the main roadway seemed to still be getting any care. What little buildings there were in La Grande were swallowed by creeping vines and twisting nettles, trees taking root and sprouted anywhere they had the space to. Emily was surprised to see such a vast amount of plant growth until she saw the little colony of nymphs lounging in the treetops of the city, and figured they must have something to do with the rapid hostile takeover. When she popped out of the other side of Legrand, then she saw more and more evidence of nature folk, the beings of wood and vine that had no want or desire to be near concrete and steel beam. They seemed friendly enough, though, and even the dryads gave her little waves from their wooden lawn chairs, cloistered together and reading garden magazines. After Legrand, she found nothing but empty highway the entire way up to Walla Walla. Any small towns or gas stations she found were abandoned, swallowed up by nature or brought low by lack of care and upkeep. It was eerie driving for so long without seeing other divers, and the only sounds of the night being the noises of the birds and trees around you. The creeping silence began to wig Emily out something fierce, and having to take side roads deeper into the forest definitely did not help with the looming silence that seemed to invade her everyday goings. When she would stop to make tea or prepare a meal, every clink of metal or scrape of a spoon would echo around her as if she had set off a mortar shell in a graveyard. The day she heard a horse nicker almost caused her to jump out of her skin, having been fiddling with the engine of her motorbike. And she turned around to see a pair of riders in the distance, dragging a small trail wagon behind them. Even with them being 100 yards away, the sound carried as if they were right beside her. She was, however, excited to see a friendly face and waved at them, which they waved back or raised their hats up in greeting. Turns out the pair of men were fishermen heading back from Milton Freewater, having been sniping up the large trout that were flourishing in the area. "I can go for some fish if you'll treat a lady," Emily said, smiling brightly up at them. One of the men smiled and took off his hat, smacking it on the side of his thigh. "Oh, not a problem. I'll sell you a whole trout for $240, ma'am." "To hell with your fish, then," Emily snapped, and all three of them laughed together, their voices ringing out and echoing in the forest. In the end, a $10 bill and a smooch on the cheek was all she paid for a smaller trout that would take care of her dinner for the night. But she dined alone, as the two fishermen were well keen on getting to Baker City as fast as possible to process their fish, before the fuel of their generator ran dry. The road to the large body of water was playing hell on her motorcycle, until eventually the city bike was no match for the bumpy, ragged roads that led down to the other side of the mountain. She moved the bike off the trail, set up a marker that she would recognize, and threw a large waterproof camo cover over her bike and trailer, making sure that some nymph didn't just happen across her bike and make off with her damn Honda Shadow. The walk wasn't nearly as comfortable as the ride, having to lug mostly water, food, and ammo in a day pack while having everything else on her chest rig. Sleeping was also a little more nerve-wracking, as she had found comfort in her motorbike being with her. Now all she had was her CZ75, her bran, and a tarp to keep her dry as she slept. A few days of this had her quite grumpy, and Emily was finding the ability to keep her hair under control getting harder and harder the more she traveled through the fizzing rain and sleeping on the ground. When she finally emerged on the other side of the tree line to view the lake where Walla Walla used to be, she looked like an NCO that had just gotten done herding 300 privates to bed. Faint bags had formed under her eyes, and she had given up on keeping her hair braided, instead just taking some cord and wrapping it down around her ponytail to keep everything in check. She unslung her rifle from her shoulder and instead slung it across her chest, her right hand resting on the pistol grip, and she stared down into the ruins of Walla Walla. For the most part, all she saw were the taller buildings near the city center, barely poking past the surface, and a scattering of roofs all around the surrounding area, with more of the building being less covered by the water the closer it got to the mountains, looking like a bunch of black and brown turtles basking in the sun. From her vantage point, she could also see things moving around in the depths of the water, looming here and there like great shadows of fish, if fish were the same size as the house it was next to. Anyway, stepping carefully, Emily made her way down the slope towards the water's edge, and she could see that a lot of the trees seemed sickly in comparison to the rest around them that were further away from the shore. She realized why when she smelled the curious odor of salt water, and she pursed her eyebrows together before remembering that this whole thing was probably fed in from the now underwater area of Portland. It didn't make logical sense that this body of water would still be salty, however. Besides the smell of a marsh greeting her, there was also a lingering scent of something else in the air, something she couldn't quite place within the smelling library of her brain. She could tell where the airport was by the many white fins and wings of aircraft that stuck out of the water at weird angles or just sat on the runway. But the majority of the city near the center was deep underwater, The water was also crystal clear, so clear that she could make out the cars that were still sitting in parking lots, with large gar swimming around them in giant schools. Emily stepped down from the descent to Walla Walla and made her way onto Mill Creek Road, most of the flat top ahead sliding into the water at a shallow angle. "So now what? I just walk along the water's edge looking for stuff?" Emily muttered. And she clicked the red dot on her rifle onto its second lowest setting. The day was still quite young, and she wanted to make the most of it before it got dark. Walla Walla had just started becoming a major city when the oceans rose and snuffed out half of the world. And they had expanded their airport to quite a degree, all for naught it seemed, since most of it was now underwater in one form or another. Emily figured it was a good place as any, and made her way towards the massive hangars and terminals. The wind was cool, the sun more warm than hot, and Emily was having a little bit of fun peeking into the old dusty buildings that still stood. One such building was a winery, in which Emily found a few old bottles of Merlot still sitting in the back in crates. "Waste not, want not," Emily said with a grin, and tucked a few of the bottles into her day pack, wrapping them in old scarves she took from the clothes hook the employees used. She thought about getting a mobile stream going, but the signal was abysmal where she was, so she just took pictures instead. While the Walla Walla Airport used to be a smaller rinky-dink of a place, the new one was trying to give major cities like Seattle. Once again, Sean Connery likes to strike. Seattle. Ay, ay, ay. This new one was trying to give major cities like Seattle and Chicago a run for their money, boasting stone carvings and statues done up by the hippie types that lived on the coast of Washington. The architecture reminded her of a spaceship of sorts, with the glass darkened, steel-looking, and all at weird angles. It wasn't ugly, but it sure didn't scream Walla Walla to her. What was eerie was how undamaged it was. All of the window glass appeared to be intact, and the only thing that really seemed to show the building's age was the amount of dust on everything. The ever-still quiet continued around here. Every sound, from the scattering of leaves to the sound of distant wind chimes, amplified the stillness of it all. When she opened the door to the front lobby, the hinges moaned like a zombie, and the sound echoed through the massive lobby to the point it sounded like a whole horde of the things were about to come shambling down the hallway, like some kind of macabre concierge service. I don't speak French. Emily shuffled past the door so she didn't have to open it any further, and pulled over a trash can to try and hold it open. If the door was loud, the rattling of an empty steel trash can was like a bomb going off, and Emily screwed her eyes shut painfully as it rattled against the door, failed to hold it open, and then scooted noisily across the tile floor. It did, however, succeed in keeping the door open, lodging itself between the door and its frame with a loud clang. She turned and leaned in past the entryway, looking left and right down the long grand hall, and closed her eyes, exhaling out of her nose. She whispered wryly, "Stealth is optional for this mission," before putting on a pair of electronic ear pro, cranking up the volume, and setting her rifle at the low ready. From what she learned from her fellow divers, books, and journals, you just had to walk around until something just popped out to you. While it sounded easy, it did, however, mean you were being hunted. Morel said it was like fishing for the shadow creatures. When they spotted a nice fishy they wanted to eat, they would cast out a lure. That lure, in this case, was some kind of item stolen from a dimension, and you were the tasty fish. If there were no items, there were no monsters, which means that you needed to look elsewhere. In some sense, you wanted to be hunted, but just smart enough to outfox whatever it was seeing you as lunch. Emily wound her way around the airport, seeing if there were any lures being set out for her. It was kind of like the airport was frozen in time. Some baggage even still lay around near seats or sitting neatly near the front check-in desks. Emily about pissed herself when she went to go through the security checkpoint and set off the alarm of the metal detector, stamping her feet in frustration at just how bad at this she was. To make her point, she kicked the metal detector and shattered one of its supports, sending the entire thing clattering to the ground in a heap of metal and plastic. "How do you even have electricity anyway?" Emily stage whispered before stomping off towards the duty-free shop. Walla Walla wanted to be competitive with Denver and installed what they claimed to be the largest duty-free shop in America, a long expanse of shelves and racks that took up more space than the security checkpoint. Emily strode through the doorless entry hallway and made a beeline for the alcohol, snatching a bottle of Stolichnaya off a low shelf before stomping back out of the duty-free shop. Emily decided to do the thing that fish do that always get fishermen excited, and made them cast their lures over in the fish's direction. Time for this fish to make some. Reared back her foot, aiming the heel of it towards some weird glass statue that stood out in front of the duty-free store. Waves! Bottle in hand, she kicked over the strange statue and it toppled over onto the tile below, shattering loudly and scattering its pieces all along the walkway. In the empty space, it sounded more akin to an explosion, and Emily threw up her arms, still clutching the bottle.
Oh yeah, it's potato time!
Emily screeched and kicked over another statue that was sitting on a display podium, sending the crystal biplane crashing down onto the floor next to where its neighbor was. Emily's reign of statue terror continued up and down the hallway, taking out her frustrations on anything that looked like it could make a bit of noise if it was knocked over or tossed to the floor. She took it a bit over the top when she hammer-tossed a metal suitcase through one of the gate windows, causing a huge cascade of glass to shatter down on the ground and launch the suitcase out onto the parkway for the aircraft. Emily decided that that was good enough, and dragged over one of the leather sofa chairs, parking it in front of the window. The cap to the vodka bottle cracked as she broke the seal and drank heavily from its neck as she stared out onto the tarmac, where a few of the surviving aircraft still sat. For a while, Emily held this pattern, just sucking down Stolichnia and chilling in the chair, just waiting for something to toss her a lure. Emily figured that Ogledock would be pulling out the rest of his mohawk if he were to be a witness to her reverse fishing technique. But Emily was going to be damned if she was going to be angler-fished by some swamp creature. When the bottle was half gone, and Emily was feeling a pretty good buzz, she breathed in deeply and pulled herself up to a proper sitting position, scanning around her to see if anything was popping out at the moment. Besides the victims of her statucidal rage, nothing was really glaring out at her from inside. She lifted the chair and hefted it around, wobbling slightly as she kept it pinned to her butt, and sat it back down so she could stare outside. As she dragged her buzzed eyes from left to right, she did see something glinting out near one of the aircrafts, and she grinned, breathing out with hot vodka-tinged breath. "You're fishy," she breathed, and she stood, holding the Bren grip in her right hand and the bottle in the other, using the sling to help keep the rifle supported. Broken glass crunched under her boots as she stepped out onto the concrete outside, her face flush as the cool wind kissed her skin. The closer Emily got to the shiny object, the more she could tell it was some kind of simple golden ring, a blue gem of some kind adorning the top of it. It looked rather plain, all things considered, as Emily was expecting something more grandeur when it came to magical items. There was no slobbering creature, no horror slinking out from the shadows, just the ring sitting next to the aircraft under the double wing-mounted engine shadows. Emily stooped down to look at the ring, sniffing, then stood back up, pushing the bottle back to her lips as she leered around. "This is it?" she slurred and held out her arms, sweeping the barrel of her Bren wide and right. She turned around in a circle, looking around just to make sure she wasn't missing anything. "A fucking ring? Oh boy, sure am glad I came all the way here for this!" Drunk Emily is fun, Emily. Emily bent over and grabbed the ring, holding it up to the fading light of the evening sun. "What do, make dogs fart or something?" On the ring were some very tiny elvish script that ran around the inside and outside of the band, and even the small blue gems seemed to be covered in the same swirling letters. Emily went to put it on her finger, but found it could only fit on her pinky finger, and she snarled a smile. "Stupid dainty old fingers." As she held up her hand to see the ring, she noticed the looming shadow of the plane. Her vodka-buzzed mind looked down from one side of the plane to the other, and she furrowed her brows. Wait a minute. 1, 2... She pointed her ringed pinky at the two engine shadows on one side, but then on the other side of the plane's shadow there was only one singular engine. "Oh, that ain't right," she murmured, and she gripped the bottle tightly along with her rifle grip. As she stepped forward, the shadow of the farthest double engine began to morph and squirm, and Emily spun around, bringing the barrel of her Bren to bear. If she had not spun around, she would never have seen the rippling buzzsaw of a mouth shoot towards her, and she ducked just in time to avoid it taking her head clean off. It did, however, get a chunk of her ponytail, and her head stung with the slight jerk it gave her as it zoomed overhead with the other half of the ponytail trailing from its mouth. She spun on her heel and began to sprint, still holding the bottle of vodka in her hand, and looked over her shoulder at the thing detaching itself from the wing. Its mouth reminded her of a bloodworm, but more horrific in the amount of serrated teeth it had, its beady black eyes sitting on short stalks that twisted in her direction as she ran. Its skin was wet and glistening in the evening sunlight, and the long slime trail of its body schlucked noisily as it detached from the wing, slapping down sloppily onto the ground. Before Emily could even register what it was doing, multiple legs sprouted out from its slimy body, and it gave a spine-chilling, gurgling shriek and was coming after her at full speed. "Ah, shit! Ah, shit!" Emily screamed, and she flipped the rifle around to rest on her shoulder, the barrel pointing behind her. Not knowing what else to do, she plugged the vodka bottle back to her lips and gulped, squeezing the trigger and firing rounds wildly behind her as she dove back into the building. Her boots squeaked on the tile as she sprinted, but she didn't hear the shattering of glass she expected the monster to make in chasing her. When she looked around behind her, she saw the creature was only 50 yards away and gaining, somehow sticking right through the hole she ran through. "Oh, what the hell is that about?" Emily roared and squeezed more rounds off behind her, except she heard the wet splack of impacts a few times to no effect. There was a large loading area to her left, and she tucked into it, almost going horizontal from the speed she was going, and had to drop the vodka bottle, the glass shattering on the ground as she placed her hand down to keep herself from falling completely. She slipped slightly on the vodka before getting back to her full footing, and dove for a small baggage rail with a little flap door on the wall, probably from the front desks for non-carry-on luggage. She wiggled her rump past the small hole and wiggled down the belt, getting past the wall and then rolling down onto the ground to continue her run. This was some kind of loading and sorting area, some of the stacks of luggage still bearing the remains of lunches and coffee cups, and Emily caused the dust on them to whirl as she ran past, gunning for a door and had a sign bearing "Front Lobby" on it. She was about to push past the door when it suddenly caved in and flew off its hinges, smashing against Emily and carrying her across the baggage area into a large stack of luggage. The air was knocked from her lungs as she landed against the pile, scattering duffels and totes across the floor as she herself skidded across the tiles, rolling a few times until she came to a stop. As her lungs struggled to pull air into them, she crawled over to where her Bren lay and dragged it towards her, hugging it to her chest as she looked around. The bloodworm thing was working its way around, snuffling at the air and smashing aside stacks of luggage when it thought she was in them. When it found the pile or stack to be empty, it would screech and then move on to another stack, and Emily was just trying not to shoot it out of reflex. As the creature smashed aside a tall tower of hard-shell totes, Emily scampered her way quickly across the floor towards another nearby door, and waited for the worm creature to scatter more luggage, then quickly cracked it open and scrambled past it. This door had a bolt on the other side, and Emily quickly slammed it down, locking the door to the frame of the wall. Her chest heaved as her lungs still fought for air, and she ran a hand through her hair, moving some loose strands out of her face, the other resting against the door as she leaned forward. Her electronic muffs were buzzing slightly, and she could hear the beast still slamming around in the other room, which meant that it hadn't heard her open the door and slip through. She found her breath, took in a deep inhale of strangely pungent, earthy air, and stood up, checking her weapon for damages. Everything on the Bren looked fine, but she was leaking wine all down her pack and down the back of her legs. At least, she hoped it was wine. It smelled like wine anyway. She turned, but her first step squelched, landing down in mud.
Oh, what the fu-
Oh, Emily trailed off as she looked up from her boot to the room in front of her, and she found it was no longer a guarantee that it was wine going down her legs and into her boots. In front of her, a huge mud mound had been constructed and took up the majority of the room, which, judging from the tables and walls, was some kind of employee break area where they could relax and eat lunch. The majority of the tables had been pressed back against the walls, old dry slimes seeming to cement them against each other to form some kind of nest. And in the middle was a giant mound of salty, fetid earth. Emily held her hand to her mouth, but the thick smell of rotting meat found its way to her nose, and bile rose in her throat. When she spied hands and faces poking out of the mud in multiple stages of decomposition, she couldn't fight down the urge to vomit, and alcohol-laden puke splashed down onto the filthy tiles at her feet. Her back heaving with the effort, she coughed and spat, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, and she gasped for air, her throat raw and hoarse.
Oh, that's so gross! Oh, God, what is that? Some kind of nest?
Emily moaned, and she edged around the mound of earth, bodies, and salt water towards the only door out of the place. The dirt mound had the door partially covered, and Emily groaned as she realized she would have to walk into the meat-laden mud to get out. She stepped once, twice, making her way towards the door, and began to tug on the handle, scooting up a mound of mud at the bottom of the door as the hinges fought the urgings to budge. Emily had managed to get it a hand space open when she heard a rustling from the mound behind her, and she hunched her shoulders, her brand hanging across her chest. Her lip quivering and nervous sweat stinging at her eyes, she slowly turned her head to see something crawling up from the center of the mound. As it pushed up, more chunks of bodies churned from its hole, spilling out and slopping down and away from the top of the mound. Emily began to quietly shriek and sob, pulling at the door while bracing one of her booted feet against the wall. Her thighs and calves burned with the effort, and Emily coughed as she fought for the fresh air coming in from the other side. Something wet thwacked out into the air, and Emily whipped her head back around hard enough to jostle her ear-pro, only to see a smaller version of the bloodworm creature making its way up, giving little mewling grunts and squeaks, and bearing its own razor-sharp fangs. Its skin was dark red compared to its parents', and its small beady eyes rolled back and forth, trying to sense what had disturbed it. It snuffled at the air just as the larger one had done, its long, tubey mouth swinging back and forth as it smelled, tasted, scented what was in the room with it. Emily heard it give a pleasured purr, and more of its body slugged up from the mound, its own tiny legs digging at the mud. The more it exposed itself, the more the rotting meat smell that permeated the air and choked Emily's nose with its foul aroma. Emily's hair stuck to the sweat on her face, and now she openly cried, tugging hard on the door as panic gripped her. "I am not gonna die in a fucking airport break room," she thought, and gave one huge push with her leg muscles while pulling with her strained arms. The door gap was just long enough for her to slide through sideways, and she lurched for the opening, driving herself through the gap recklessly. She had just popped out on the other side when something grabbed her boot forcefully and yanked her, whipping her off her feet with the squeak of rubber sole on slick tile. Emily came down hard on her face and chest and screamed as she was dragged backwards, bringing up her free foot and thudding it against the wall. She lifted her head up and saw the damn thing had her by the foot and was trying to drag her back inside. There were also more of the creatures burrowing out of the mound and giving their own squeaks of hunger, their mouths working and stretching out in anticipation of a meal. The creature gave an energetic tug and Emily's legs slipped, going vertical up the wall and costing her precious distance. Her calf sliding along in the mud, she was caught in the corner of the door frame in the pit of her crotch and let out a yell of pain, but was still able to hold her own even from here. "Fuck you!" Emily roared in terror and brought up her brin, blasting away with it into the room and at the thing holding her boot. It was frankly a miracle that she hadn't blown her own toes off, managing to score a hit somewhere on the young bloodworm's creature's neck, and it twisted, shredding the laces of her boot and taking the footwear with it. With her foot free, Emily skittered back through the door and yanked it closed with a hard twist of her arms and torso. The foul mud was all over her now, having been dragged back and forth through the gap, and it now coated her bootless leg, and a fair bit had gotten stuck on her hands. She noticed with horror that someone's rotting finger was stuck to her sock, and she kicked her foot with a yuck and a small screech of female humors. At that, Emily had a full-body reaction to the experience as a whole, wiggling and flailing her hands while quietly squealing at the thought of that little wormy bastard even touching her boot. After a solid few seconds of freaking out, she remembered that a larger version was probably aware of what was going on, and she looked around at where she was. This was definitely some kind of hallway to offices. It had carpet for some reason, and she took off at a dead sprint, her one boot thunking down awkwardly as she ran. She dropped the mag in her brin and slammed in a new one as she came out beside a car rental kiosk and saw the blessed car park outside along with the ever-lowering sun. Emily broke into a sprint past the door and went in a straight line towards the mountains, getting as far away from the salt water as she could. When a car was in her way, she aimed for the hood and slid over it, coming down on the other side without losing her stride. By the time her lungs seized and her hands started shaking, she made it partially up the hill and 600 yards away from the airport down below. She found a grassy place to rest and fell down in a heap, breathing heavily and sucking greedily at the fresh mountain air around her. She stank, she could tell that much, and she undid the fasteners of her chest rig, pulling it up and off her sweaty, filth-coated chest. "I'm gonna have to wash all those magazines," she panted, and then she laughed. She laughed and laughed until she coughed, rolling onto her side and coughing some more until more laughter and giggles could come through. I'm alive, she thought, and she pushed out her hand to look at the tiny ring that adorned it, also covered in the fetid corpse mud. Her face stung from a few scratches, and a small black eye was starting to develop on her face, using her phone's front-facing camera to check herself out, and she had to admit she looked like shit. She was glad she didn't take her jacket with her and left it with the bike, as she was pretty sure that the clothes she was wearing were going to need to be burned, and would be more than happy to buy a new chest rig if she had to. Emily thought back to that lovely morning a few weeks before, sitting there on the couch, eating scooteros and watching the news in the wholesome comfort of the HVAC system. She rolled the ring around in her hand, her fingers caked in wine-soaked mud, and for the first time in a long time she actually ached for the smell of an espresso machine. The barrel of her Bren rifle scalded her exposed ankle, and Emily winced angrily, the scratches on her face from where she fell down aching at the stretch of injured skin. I had to open my big mouth, Emily sighed, and she looked down at the flooded city of Walla Walla. I hope there's a nice paycheck tied to you, little guy, Emily murmured before tucking the ring back onto her finger and standing up. She bundled her gear together and began to make her way back to her bike, the night beginning to fall down around her. She figured that if a cougar or bear happened to pop up on her way back, it would be child's play compared to those worm things, and the smell of her alone should keep away anything wanting a meal that tastes good. In the end, Emily bundled up her foul clothes and buried them in the ground beside her motorbike, stuffing the chest rig into a garbage bag and tucking it into a saddlebag so it could air out but not stink up her leathers. The few days' walk back to her bike had her feeling disgusting, with no way to wash herself completely, and she had to sleep in her fetid clothes and gear. She didn't even bother camping or sleeping after getting back to her bike, just driving through the night wearing nothing but her underwear and her sports bra. Emily wanted to be as far away from Walla Walla as she could manage, and only stopped when she was outside La Grande. Her body ached for sleep, but she wanted to wash first, and she remembered passing a little stream on her way to Walla Walla. Driving through the night to La Grande only took a couple of hours, and Emily was happy to see the rising moon was bright and cheery in the inky sky. When she arrived at the river she remembered passing, she pulled her Honda to the side of the road and parked it, brushing away any bugs that got past her windscreen and ended up on her shoulders. With little ceremony, she dug out her towel, a bar of soap, shampoo, a cloth, and boogied down to the side of the river. Her sports bra and underwear were shunted off and thrown to the bank, and Emily splashed into the cold waters, brushing herself rapidly with the soap. As she scrubbed the bar of soap every place imaginable, a nymph shot up from the depths of the surface, sputtering water from her mouth. "Whoa, what did you roll in to smell like that, little Tyran?" The nymph had pale blue flesh compared to the other green ones she was used to seeing, and surmised that she must be one of the water ones that did weird things like tie the anchor lines of boats together or steal the shoes of people hanging them over the water's edge. She was pretty, with bright shimmering purple eyes and short hair that reminded her of pinks. "I didn't roll in anything," Emily said, raising her arm and busily rubbing soap into her rank pit. "Got grabbed by a damn worm thing that lives in dead flesh, stole my boot, and tried to eat me." The nymph eyed Emily's flesh in curiosity, observing the freckles that ran down her chest and shoulders. "Maloo's hoog?" Emily asked, as she turned slightly so the damn nymph would stop staring below her clavicles. The nymph giggled and kicked her feet slightly, swinging around the same side Emily turned.
"Yes, the shapeshifter. Likes to pretend to be things. Killed many a human, so he must be in the hundreds by now. Usually takes their heads first in a clean swoop so he can save the body for later."
"Yeah, for his creepy little fucking kids," Emily muttered and shuddered, remembering the little bastard that had grabbed her foot. She scrubbed it herself with the washcloth, rubbing it down around her thighs and calves in order to get the smell of wine and other stuff off of her. The nymph rested her head on her hands and watched Emily wash herself, tilting her head back and forth while humming.
"Yes, many Mulzug dwell down in the Walla Walla area, all hiding and lurking about waiting for prey."
"Yeah, well, they're cheap dates. All I got was this damn ring." Emily held up her hand while the other dumped way too much shampoo into her hair. The nymph squinted and clicked her tongue at the ring, then shrugged.
"Don't recognize that one."
Emily snorted and took both hands into her soapy mane, working the mound of red hair into a bubbling froth. She noticed that the nymph had gone back to staring at her and realized that the nymph was enjoying the show more than she would have liked. "Hey, can you bugger off or something?"
Nah.
The nymph said and wrinkled her nose in a smile at Emily. Emily growled, baring a bit of her teeth at the nymph and turning her back to the creature. "Geez, leave me alone. I've had a rough enough night as it is." Emily managed to get herself clean and free of any grit, grime, or death mud, and did one last dunk under the water to get any lingering suds from her hair and flesh. When she surfaced and went to grab her towel, she realized that the damn nymph had not only stolen it, but her soap, shampoo, underwear, and sports bra as well. "What?
Hey, you little turd, get back here! That's my only towel!"
Her cries were, naturally, only answered with the tinkling sound of nymph laughter, and the walk to her motorbike was twice as cold as the water was. As Emily put on her fresh clothes, she grumbled under her breath about water nymphs and how she was taking a gun with her next time she had to take a bath in a stream. When she no longer smelled of death and wearing clothes that didn't stick to her like another layer of flesh, Emily rolled out her tent and made camp right there next to the road, not even bothering to eat, but just to sleep. Wrapped up in her camp blanket and her travel pillow, sleep came to her like a wraith, swallowing her in shadow and choking out anything that tried to permeate her mind. She had expected a nightmare or two, but found nothing but the black to comfort her in her rest. To Emily, it was as if she had a long blink, and suddenly morning was shining down upon the walls of her tent. She groaned and rubbed at her face with her hand, her head slightly thrumming with the beat of her heart. The metal of the found ring was cold against her flesh for some reason, and she held it to her temple, sighing as the cold permeated into her skull. The blue gem glowed faintly, then the light snuffed out as quickly as it came, and Emily gave it a little shake to see if any of the light would come back. "Huh," she mused, then stood up, cracking her spine and stretching her sore muscles. When she unzipped the door of her tent, she was greeted by the sight of the water nymph from the night before, standing proudly from the shore of the little river, her feet still submerged in the burbling water. Emily lowered her eyelids, the corners of her mouth curling into a small, annoyed smile, and she drummed the fingers of the hand she placed on the soft grass to get out. "Proud of yourself, are you?" The nymph, wearing Emily's sports bra and underwear, beamed at her with slightly bluish teeth, bouncing up and down on the balls of her feet while her hands were clasped behind her back. Emily, further growing her annoyance, noticed that the nymph had cut artistic holes in the bra to further show off her flesh, and Emily clicked her tongue in bitter aggravation, knowing that the thing had cost her almost a week's pay at her old coffee shop job. "You know what? Just keep it," Emily growled before fully climbing out of her tent to make some food. The nymph was content to play and splash in the water near Emily, even having the gall to ask her if she had any more clothes she could play with. She would only retreat when Emily would jerk the bottle of hot sauce her way, sending small drops of Hot Ones Classic plopping into the water's edge. But after the hot sauce was washed away by the slow current, the nymph would show back up and flick some of the clear water back at Emily. After finishing up her little egg and bacon sandwich, Emily put on a spare pair of boots, her last pair now that she thought about it, her motorcycle jacket, a fresh pair of pants, and set off down the road. It was funny, now that she had her first true shoulder brush with death, she was finding herself enjoying certain things more. The rush of the wind around her, the taste of coffee from a diner, the taste of tacos being the most wonderful thing ever, and the feeling of both her feet being attached to her legs, and the accomplishment of knowing I won seemed to feel more whole than they used to. Passing through Baker City was a sorrowful time, as Emily wanted to stop by the recovery team side of the hospital there. When she told the Java-hopped workers what she had found and where it was, they shrugged and pulled out a small folder of missing people that were running dives in the area. One woman began spreading pictures along the long first desk. "Well, we can't do much since you didn't grab any body parts, but if you remember what their heads looked like, you might be able to identify some of them." Emily gave a shudder, and the ring's gem gave a soft shimmer of light. For some reason, she felt a little better, and the light died away. "I remember their faces." "Going to be hard to forget." Emily shuffled through the smiling faces, donated pictures from those who knew the missing. Most of them were in front of a birthday cake, blowing out their candles. Others were smiling with family or holding a cherished pet in their arms. Others were snapshots from police records, college ID photos, and some were even military photos. Stern faces staring out from under the brim of patrol caps. Emily did recognize many of them, not only by their faces, but by some of the tattoos some of them wore, having spotted pieces of flesh that bore the ink. She was surprised by the clarity of how she remembered the scene, but that was honestly worse in this regard. She also came to realize she was not the first woman to try this gig, recognizing a few of the faces from the pictures. One woman struck her in particular, because she remembered the head rolling down the mud mound and landing facing her while the monster tried to drag her back. She remembered the dull, opaque look in her long, dead eyes, her mouth slightly parted as the worms wriggled and squirmed inside, and now her once pretty blonde hair fell over her filthy face. The picture crinkled in her fingers, and Emily realized she was panting and crunching the small photo in her hands. When she caught herself and looked up, the recovery personnel were just standing politely by, waiting for her to come back to reality. I remember her, and this man too, and this one. I saw his tattooed arm. Thanks to her reliving her nightmare, Emily was able to identify 10 missing people that had gone north into the Walla Walla remains, and she had an inkling feeling that even more had been turned into baby food by that disgusting bloodworm thing over time. The body parts on the pile must have been the freshest of the meals, and the core of that mound was just a boiling meat soup.
So gross,
Emily whispered with a tremor, but filled out the paperwork required with the recovery team, then headed back to her bike and continued on her journey home. Instead of her slow journey north, camping and taking her time, Emily roared straight through to Logan, not slowing until she saw the glow of the city and the dark looming profiles of the mountains in the night sky. She didn't stop her bike until she pulled into the parking lot of the company building and kicked out the stand roughly with the jerk of her boot. Leaving everything but her guns in her trailer, she opened the door and went straight to her own dormitory, pulling out the key to unlock her attuned doorknob. The key was humming a different tune this time, and despite Emily's mood, she held the key up to her ear. Shake it off, huh? Interesting choice for a key. She plugged the key into its hole and twisted, the door coming unlocked with a soft click of the bolt. And she walked in, placing her Bren into its rack along with the extra AR-15 she had brought with her. She could hear someone clicking away at a controller from the TV area, and shuffled off her boots and socks, her bare feet smacking down on the tile as she walked down the hallway. She could tell by the sounds that it was Marill playing her fighting games, being one of the few people in the building that held a strange fondness for the older street fighters. The centaur was laid out on her ground pillow, wearing a long nightshirt that sported Sabaton's tour dates and Attack of the Dead Men as its main headliner. Emily flopped down next to the centaur on the ground pillow, letting the soft material swallow her while resting her hands on her stomach. Marill leaned towards her, fingers deftly clicking away at the controller. Hey, Ems, have fun on your first dive? Emily's mind flashed with the images of the bloodworm creature, Mulzug, chasing after her, the sounds of its children, the mud mound, the body parts, the feeling of the little creature pulling her towards the other smaller Mulzugs that were crawling out, ready to eat her. Nymph stole my sports bra, found a ring, nothing big. Ah yeah, those nymphs can be like that. I take a knife with me when I bathe in anything not a tub. Glad you had an easy time of it. Marill patted Emily on her thigh with a few cheerful smacks before going back to her game. Emily sighed, giving the centaur a few pats on the rump in return. Thanks, Marill. That would be the end of Chapter 3. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you liked the video, let us know by hitting the thumbs up and telling us in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this one, check out the rest of the Guardbeardia channel and hit subscribe. But make sure to hit that little bell on the side, otherwise YouTube won't be able to tell you when another video is up. And if any of you lovely folks would like to make a donation, make sure to label it with my name or the title of the video so that way it can get to Guardbeardia and to me. And until we all see you next time, this has been the Bell Dam.
All those moments will be lost in time. Like tears in rain.
Oh yeah, it's potato time!
hard. I am so tired if that's making me laugh so hard. Okay.